Welcome to Versus Trump, the podcast where we talk about how the Trump administration is breaking the law and what people are doing about it. I'm one of your hosts, Jason Harrow, and I'm here this week with Charlie Gerstein. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, everybody. I noticed that when we start the show, you guys are usually looking at your notes or whatever, not looking at our little video feed to each other. I do like a little pre-show dance, and I think you guys miss it every single time. So listeners know, I'm not going to describe it for you.
Is it hands only, or are we missing it altogether?
We can't see and shoulders.
Okay, so the fact that we can't see you from the waist down, not ruining it. Okay, it's really just a problem of our attention
Maybe
spans.
tapping my feet a little bit.
Fun times. And that other voice is Isha Anand. Hey, Isha.
Hi, Jason. How's it going?
Doing great. And this week on Versus Trump, we return to what we've sometimes called the granddaddy of all Versus Trump cases, because it, of course, is the special counsel investigation of the president and all of his associates and the Trump campaign and the Trump administration over Russian meddling in the election and possibly the campaign of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. So it is the ultimate Versus Trump case. It's not the first episode we've done on it. It is not the last. But Charlie and Isha, as you know, since we've last talked about it, mucho has happened. So let's get everyone up to speed, and we're going to try, listeners, to give a little bit of a different angle and some inside baseball, and we'll, of course, focus on the legal stuff. We're not going to opine on whether this will result in the president's impeachment. At least we're not going to opine yet.
Although we've promised Charlie that the day that Democrats retake the House, which he views as a certainty, not a potentiality. You said when, not if.
That's optimism.
Okay. All right. Well, we promised Charlie that if Democrats take the House, which is how I would put that, we will do a whole episode about impeachment. So if you need any more reason to go out and donate to Democratic candidates and knock on doors, you can hear Charlie's thoughts on whether Donald Trump's going to get impeached if you manage to succeed in having the Democrats retake the House. Obviously, the highest of priorities.
There you go. So before we dive into it, you can reach us on the web at takecareblog.com/podcast, at Versus Trump Pod on Twitter, Versus Trump Podcast at gmail.com, which appears to be the preferred way for many of you to reach us. We really appreciate it. We've gotten some really good, thoughtful, long emails over the last couple weeks, and we appreciate people taking the time to really think through some of these issues with us. So thanks for those. And of course, you can rate us on iTunes and your favorite podcast players. You can tell people about us by actually talking to them over a beer or over dinner or something like that as well. I should mention that. I usually don't. Okay, with that out of the way, we're going to kind of go from, in some ways, the lowest profile, the thing you may have read least about here, up to Paul Manafort, who is kind of the most known player that's been indicted so far. So, Charlie, why don't you start with your favorite new character in the Mueller investigation saga?
Yes. So I'm going to start by talking about Alex Vanderzwaan, but before I do that, I have to tell our listeners something, which is that I am a recipient of something called the Skadden Fellowship, which is from the Skadden Fellowship Foundation, which is funded by the law firm of Skadden Arps, which employed Mr. Vanderzwaan until last year. I don't view that as influencing my discussion of his case. I receive my money from the fellowship, not from the firm, but now you know. So this whole story starts with a report that was commissioned by former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko, well, before he had left office, which he has since recently done. And he wanted a report from Skadden helping to explain why his prosecution of his predecessor and political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko, was not an outright political fraud. But he didn't want it to come quite from the Ukrainian government, so he essentially gave money to a front nonprofit called the Center for a Better Europe or something. I can't remember the actual name. And through Paul Manafort, hired Skadden. And Skadden was tasked, and this is something that law firms do, with writing a report on the fairness of this prosecution. And although it concluded that the prosecution would not comply with Western due process standards, it appears that the report, which I've read, ignores glaring failures of this prosecution. So much so that it would appear to be semi-deliberate, ignoring the failures of this prosecution. That is not what anyone is charged with. Instead, Alex Vanderzwaan, who is a lawyer at the London office of Skadden Arps, he's Dutch-born, I believe now a UK resident, speaks a bunch of languages, is a fabulously well-educated guy, lied to the FBI about a meeting with Paul Manafort. So he said the last time he spoke to Paul Manafort was in 2015, and he had actually and obviously met with Paul Manafort in May of 2016. And that is a pretty simple crime, violating 18 U.S.C. 1001, which forbids lying to federal officials. And he promptly pleaded guilty to it. That alone is an unremarkable story, although it fits within a narrative of lawyers behaving atrociously that come up.
Charlie's favorite narrative.
Yes, not only was he sanctioned for this, he was prosecuted for this. Although he was not prosecuted for authoring the report, which, if deliberately misleading and signed by an attorney in his capacity as an attorney, is surely sanctionable by the state bars. And it's worth noting that the report's lead author was Gregory Craig, who's a partner in the Washington office at Skadden, and Barack Obama's former White House counsel. So this thing all has a way of coming around to everybody. And so Vanderzwaan's guilty plea does not strike me as terribly interesting on its own. Like, you lie to the FBI. It appears that Mueller is very scrupulous about prosecuting people who lie during his investigation. But what's interesting is why they're investigating this part of these transactions at all. And we have a lot left to learn here. And that's going to be a theme of this discussion, which is, why is Robert Mueller charging the people that he's charging when he's charging them? We really don't know, but this is a particularly interesting part of this story that I'm looking forward to hearing more about. This report, what Paul Manafort had to do with authoring it, whether the folks at Skadden knew that the money was actually coming from an entity that was not the entity that said it was paying them. They've given about half of the money back, but that's apparently just because they didn't do as much work as they expected.
Okay, so Charlie, that is super interesting. This was kind of out of left field and has a lot of unusual aspects that I want to discuss. But one of them, and this is a simpler and more straightforward point, is that this, along with the indictment that came out around the same time of all these Russian entities, is an extraterritorial indictment, right? This person works in the London office and is not a U.S. citizen. So, Charlie, can you just talk a little bit about, like, how is this even in a United States indictment in a United States court?
Yeah, well, he lied to the United States FBI, and you can't do that wherever you are and of whatever country you're a citizen. And I presume he could have, if he did not come to the United States, been indicted in the United States and fought his extradition from the UK. He would not have been successful for the most part because he's extraditable. And extradition is the process where, if you want to go from one state to another or from one country to another, the prosecuting country orders that the other country send you there. He could have resisted that. He pleaded guilty almost immediately. And so I'd imagine one of the things he would fight is any objection to that sort of thing. But he probably had none anyway. It appears that he came to the United States a decent amount, and he was not extradited. He is actually just prosecuted in the United States and surrendered in the United States.
Yeah, that's good enough for me. But I do think it's worth noting that this now signals the worldwide scope of this investigation, and that's unusual to some people. But U.S. criminal law applies worldwide in some ways for many different reasons, right? As you said, Charlie, you can't lie to the FBI no matter where you are. You also can't meddle in United States elections, no matter where you are located when you do that meddling.
Well, we should note in terms of the kind
if you're not a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, I'm using meddling in the non-technical sense. I'm in the criminal sense there.
And I was just going to say, we should note, while we're on the subject of the international scope, this is somehow already old news, even though it happened like last week. But we should note that there have also been 13 Russians charged in a 37-page indictment of a conspiracy to defraud the United States. And this indictment kind of lays out basically a 4-year effort to undermine the 2016 presidential election. They're accused of using social media and sort of stealing the identities of U.S. citizens to kind of manipulate the campaign. And a few of them are also charged with identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud. But in that case, none of the folks were actually arrested, right? Because Russia doesn't really believe in extradition. The press coverage said that Russia virtually never extradites its citizens. And so there, the kind of point of the indictment seems to be serving a sort of naming and shaming function. Basically, like, you can't travel abroad because there's some chance you'll go someplace that will extradite you. And maybe it makes it more difficult for you to kind of do business internationally.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that they're all charged with a conspiracy to defraud the United States, which is kind of an interesting charge in this context because in the literal sense, we would imagine, they conspired to defraud the United States voters with respect to whom they would select for president. What they actually are charged with is defrauding United States government entities by attempting to deliberately to frustrate their efforts to A, regulate United States campaign finance laws, B, regulate United States registration of foreign lobbying activities, which is like the law that requires that you tell the Justice Department when you're being paid by a foreign government, and third, to regulate like the U.S. immigration and nationality laws. So basically what they're charged with doing is trying to screw up the U.S. efforts to prevent them from violating the law. They're not actually charged with violating those specific laws, which is a little bit odd. I mean, it seems to fit the evidence, and like that is very much what they did. But I think, there's been some commentary out there about why Mueller is choosing the kinds of charges that he's choosing. And I'm wondering if you guys have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, there's a good piece about this on Just Security that we can link to. I think it's on Just Security. And they talk about how murky the underlying criminal violations are. The charge of foreign involvement in United States campaigns or elections and messing with the campaign finance laws is so unusual, right? I mean, there are so few prosecutions there on the books that the outer limits of those statutes themselves are very vague. Really vague. And so defending those could be easier than the conspiracy to violate them, because as you both know, you don't need to actually complete that underlying crime. You just need an intent and overt acts and further of those underlying crimes. So, and the second reason that they might want to charge conspiracy here is that in a conspiracy charge, it's very easy to bring in other co-conspirators, because the government doesn't have to prove that the other conspirators were on board with absolutely every part of it, participated in every element of the underlying crime. They just have to basically prove that the government, that is, has to prove that these people were joining in general in this conspiracy with illegal ends. And so it just makes life easy for the government in a lot of ways. As Isha, you want to just kind of fill in the details of exactly why that is, and then we can get back to our favorite lawyer.
Our favorite lawyer. Yeah, so regular listeners have probably heard us do this spiel a couple times, but for new listeners or folks who need a quick refresher, so conspiracy is this kind of legal concept that basically means that you can get a whole group of people for basically working toward committing a crime, even if the crime wasn't actually committed, and even if the particular person you're targeting was not the one who sort of was the worst actor. So all you need kind of classically to prove conspiracy under, sort of like the ancient common law is you just need an agreement. You need an agreement to commit a crime. That's enough for conspiracy. The federal statute, 18 U.S.C. 371, under which Mueller is proceeding, requires something called an overt act by some member of the conspiracy. So you need not only an agreement among a bunch of people to commit some sort of crime, but you also need at least one of them to do something kind of in furtherance of the conspiracy. So if you look at some of these indictments, for example, the indictments of the Russians and some of the others, you'll see that there's a section labeled overt acts, which literally lists all the possible actions that someone took that could count as sort of starting the conspiracy. So once you've got an agreement, and once you can prove that there's an agreement among a group of people to commit a crime, and once you've got an overt act, meaning you've taken some step toward that crime, that's enough. So under federal conspiracy law, that's sufficient to get you a criminal sentence, even if you never make it to your criminal objective. And every member of the conspiracy, that is every party to the agreement, is held liable for that conspiracy. So basically be careful before you sign on to something, because you're kind of going to be held liable for the acts of all your co-conspirators. So in those two ways, the crime is what we call inchoate, so it doesn't have to actually happen yet. And it's a group crime, meaning you're being held responsible for the actions of other people who are parties to this agreement for anything they do to try to effectuate the crime. You sort of loosen the standard of proof, because you can charge something that's really preliminary, that hasn't yet reached the phase of completing a crime, and you can charge someone who's kind of on the periphery of something. So you can say whether or not you were the one who actually took any steps toward this, you were part of this agreement, so you're responsible for anything that anyone else in this agreement did.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And Isha, I think for exactly that reason, we'll probably see even more indictments with conspiracy as one of the crimes charged. But Charlie, getting back to our favorite Dutch lawyer here, Mr. Vanderzwaan, it is unusual that he is, I should say, a lawyer, right? And not just a lawyer, like an associate at a large law firm. Just how weird is this to you?
Very weird. It is very, very weird. And so I slightly misstated something earlier. He pleaded guilty to lying about his most recent contacts with, among another person, Rick Gates, not Paul Manafort. And part of that is weird to me, too. So he said the last time I spoke to him was time X, and actually it was a few months later than that. And I just, in order to charge him with lying to the FBI, he has to know that was false. right? You have to knowingly lie to the FBI. If you just happen to say something false to the FBI, that's not a crime. If you're sloppy about your dates or you forgot your fucking calendar at the interview, that's not a crime. So they had evidence to believe and had at least convinced him that evidence was sufficient to justify his guilty plea, which is not always that high, but he did it. So it's got to be some evidence of this, that he knowingly lied about this contact. And that is pretty surprising. The whole report was what a former U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine described as a nasty little piece of work, and something that the lawyers who authored it, according to this ambassador, ought to be ashamed of. And having read it, it really did look like a whitewash, which is not what lawyers are supposed to be doing. It's not a proper way to earn your living, to mislead for foreign governments. There's no allegation that they knew the money was coming from a foreign government, but there is an allegation that they knew that the report was unduly favorable to the Ukrainian government, which is not itself a crime. It's just shitty lawyering and shitty behavior. So there's that, but the lying is pretty weird. People lie to the FBI because they're afraid and thoughtless, and this is one of the many reasons why you don't. And when I say thoughtless, I don't mean stupid. They're literally not thinking about it. This is one of the reasons why good criminal defense attorneys often discourage their clients from talking to federal investigators, because stuff like this can happen. But there it is. Yeah, and Jason, to your question, it's very unusual, I would say, and I was very surprised.
Yeah, what really jumped out at me here was, and maybe this is signaling, or maybe this is just Mueller's view of how prosecutions work, but the view that this indictment shows of responsibility is pretty stunning and quite out of line with the way that the Department of Justice traditionally views responsibility, right? This person is an associate at a major law firm. He is a lawyer. And he seems to be like a fairly extraneous player. That is a really unusual person to lay a lot of responsibility on for this report. It's true, Charlie. We've all worked in some degree or familiar with law firms. We know that associates do a lot of the work. But oftentimes it's the partner, as you said here, it was Greg Craig whose name comes on these things, and the investigators are going after the partners and viewing them as responsible. So it's a little amazing that the FBI is even picking around an associate in the first place. But then he himself has an interview directly with the FBI, lies, and then is charged. That is just an amazing, perhaps it's a shot across the bow by the Mueller investigation that is basically we play by the rules here, people, right? It doesn't matter who you are. Yeah, don't lie to us. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you work for. It doesn't matter what level you are. If you talk to us, you be truthful. We're the FBI, right? And I don't know. This seems really unusual to me. Maybe, like I said, I can't put my head around whether it's signaling, whether he's a large piece in the puzzle, whether he's got information that he's flipping. But I don't know, Isha, can you, he's an associate at a large law firm. How strange is that?
Yeah, it's worth noting that Isha is an associate at a large law firm.
It's heading a little close to home. I will say, so I don't actually have any kind of insider intel to this effect, but one of the interesting things the Times noted is that Skadden has been one of a small number of law firms that have kind of struck this interesting balance where they both do work for kind of image conscious US companies, and they represent a lot of kind of fairly risky international clients. So they've got a lot of Russian oligarchs. They've got a lot of companies with really close ties to Putin. They do a lot of work in kind of former Soviet states. And so there does seem to be something about, and they've been kind of aggressive in staking out, according to the New York Times, again, no insider information. They've been somewhat aggressive about kind of staking out this ground, that they are both a kind of reputable law firm that represents the kind of Fortune 500 companies in the US, and they do this kind of risky, represent these sort of risky, somewhat more liminal players. And so I do wonder whether there is something about their business model or the way that they have to turn a blind eye to certain things that their Russian oligarch clients are doing or saying or demanding that pushes some of the burden or risk down the totem pole in some way. Does that make any sense to you guys?
Yeah, and it's also not an uncommon and certainly not foreign to this investigation technique to start with the little guys and try to roll them up to the big guys. And one of the easy ways to get the little guys is lying to the FBI when they lie to the FBI.
Right. Remember, the very first person to plead guilty in this case was George Papadopoulos,
George Coffee Boy Papadopoulos.
Right, exactly. So, yeah.
So this could be that.
Right.
And it could be, and this is a comment I wanted to make as a general point about all of these things. we're speculating about why Robert Mueller is doing things. And one of the reasons why he might be doing things is to obscure the progress of the investigation, right? To make it difficult to figure out what he's actually going to, because it does seem like a scattershot series of indictments that aren't necessarily closing in on exactly one goal. I also think, as a general matter, he now very much has a reputation for, as Jason said, like, don't fuck with him in this investigation because he's not going to tolerate intentionally false statements at any point.
Right. So, like, remember, both George Papadopoulos and Mike Flynn, the only charges were lying charges, right? Like, George Papadopoulos lies about, so far, but they pled guilty. So the only leverage he needed to deploy was the lying to the FBI charge. So we now have 3 people who sort of sole, at least public indictment charges before they pled guilty were just lying charges, nothing else. And so I do think that's if nothing else, the kind of scorched earth approach, saying we'll get you on the line, like, we will bring that lying charge whether or not we've got anything else, is certainly effective messaging. Yeah,
and there's also, lying is also one of these interesting, so I mentioned earlier, like, this is a good way to roll the little fish up to the big fish. It's actually kind of a bad way to roll the little fish up to the big fish if you have any other way to do that, because definitionally it means that on cross-examination, if the little fish testifies against the big fish's lawyer can say, well, you lie, like, in important circumstances, right? This is an important circumstance. You're under oath here. You understand that, right? And you weren't under oath last time, so I get that's a difference. But you just lied to the FBI. You're a liar, right? It makes it a lot easier to impeach that person's credibility before a jury. So I feel like if you have other choices and you have some chance of believing that this witness's lies are not going to come out in the process of a trial necessarily, then you wouldn't charge them with lying under oath, or lying to the FBI. But there you have it.
Yeah. So should we talk about the other guilty plea of the week as well, which was, as you know, of Rick Gates, who is an associate of former campaign manager Paul Manafort, who, Charlie, you called this, although it wasn't too difficult to call, but there were some papers filed about a month or so ago saying that Gates had changed his counsel and he brought in new lawyers who were real specialists in pleading guilty, and he was kind of conspicuously silent, and there were some other things on the docket that indicated a guilty plea. And then, in fact, we get this guilty plea, and that does not bode well for Mr. Manafort, certainly, because Rick Gates, again, Manafort's associate, came into federal court. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges, specifically regarding his involvement in a scheme to help Manafort use these offshore bank accounts, including one in Cyprus, to launder money. So that was like a 45-minute hearing, apparently. And in exchange, he is cooperating with government attorneys. He's turning over all the documents he has. And he will presumably testify against Manafort if it gets to that and it goes to a trial. And what else does he do? Oh, and in exchange, he was able to have the government dismiss a litany of other charges that they brought against him and against Manafort as well. So that was the terms of the deal for Mr. Rick Gates. What does this smell like to you, Isha? Does this change anything from what we knew from the original indictment? Or is it just this was inevitable and, the evidence is what it is, and Manafort is still in the same position that he was even before this guilty plea?
I think one thing that's interesting is it kind of resolves a sort of thorny kind of docket puzzle that people have been following. So Zoe Tillman over at BuzzFeed is probably one of the best reporters in terms of up-to-the-minute news about this stuff. And she notes that there's this kind of confusing situation where the grand jury first indicts Manafort alone on February 13th. Then 9 days later, on February 22nd, they return a superseding indictment that's against Manafort and Gates. And now that some of the stuff has been unsealed, we can see that, they're sort of substantively similar. In fact, she does a sort of side-by-side comparison, and Gates is almost certainly the person just named as conspirator A in the Manafort indictment. And, the theory is it looks like Gates was cooperating at the outset. That's why the first indictment is just against Manafort. Then things get shaky and Mueller decides, okay, we need a little more leverage for this guy. And then 24 hours after that indictment, he agrees to a plea deal.
Yeah, and I'm going to inject myself as a primary source here. I was down at the DDC courthouse, District of the District of Columbia, to take a dumb oath to join the Southern District of Texas bar, which I needed to do in a federal court. When I went down there, the clerk who was setting this all up for me pointed me to the part of the courthouse where reporters stand constant vigil to see who is coming in and out. And there indeed were 3 reporters and 1 person with a television camera, and they are there from morning to night every single day, just waiting in the public area of the courthouse to see if they can catch someone exiting and leaving. So this is a very well monitored situation at this point.
Wow.
That is, I didn't know we had the budget for actual reporting here at Versus Trump, but I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Did you, but did you see anyone exiting or
No, I'm afraid I did not.
Okay. If you had at this time, you would, of course, have seen Rick Gates doing so. Again, it was inevitable, but it is still fairly stunning, remember, to folks that this is a high-ranking Trump campaign official, a prime associate of Donald Trump, the now president, who was just indicted and pleaded guilty to moving around tens of millions of dollars related to doing off-the-books work for Eastern European clients and things. I mean, I guess it remains technically true, right, that as Trump keeps tweeting, this guilty plea doesn't change the fact that Trump, there's no evidence of collusion, but it certainly starts to seem stranger and stranger, these connections to Eastern Europe and Russia and a lack of any control that Trump seemed to have over these people. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I do think, we should note that I think one thing that's kind of interesting about this whole situation is part of the Rick Gates plea statement is he says something like, the reality of how long this legal process is going to take and, the cost, and I think he calls it the circus-like atmosphere. I think that in terms of securing these guilty pleas, as we've noted, Mueller kind of charges very particular things, and circus-like has a sort of pejorative connotation, but I mean, like, Rick Gates is right to basically say, like, there is very little chance that he, at the end of all this, there are much bigger guns on him than he can sort of like fight effectively, right? I mean, I think even sort of well-funded counsel can't necessarily contend with the kind of whole snowball of stuff that's kind of happening here. I don't know, do you guys, is that sort of too much sympathy I'm proffering here?
I think that's right, Isha, especially the nature of the charges against Manafort and Gates, and we got into this, they were the first indictment that dropped, if I recall, are such that this will be the easiest case for the government, right? There just are these financial records that they appear to have showing money laundering, and they just were doing work that was not properly reported. And so there's not as we've said before, there's not a lot of like intent, there's not a lot of ambiguity. What in the campaign finance context, there needs to be this exchange for a thing of value by a foreign national to a campaign. There's none of that ambiguity here, right? There's just, were you responsible for this offshore account that existed in Cyprus that you were avoiding taxes and using illegal proceeds for? Yeah. And if you were, then what are you going to do?
Yeah, it sounds like the evidence against them is pretty strong. So I think one of the reasons why even well-funded and diligent counsel would have some trouble getting out of this is that there's a lot of evidence against them.
The circus-like atmosphere is actually incidental to all that.
Yes. Yeah, like one of the reasons why it looks like such a shitty situation is that it's a really shitty situation, right? I mean, and I think it's interesting that Manafort has not pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's not looking good for him. It might be looking so bad that that's part of the reason why they can't reach a deal. Anything he would accept is the crimes are so serious at this point that they're negotiating. He's an old man. He's like, fuck it, I'm not getting out of jail anyway, so I might as well fight this.
Yeah.
I don't think they would be that severe with him if he has serious information. And, I think they're adding charges against him to try to make him understand how serious this is going to get if he does not cooperate. But he seems pretty intent on not cooperating, and he issued a pretty scathing statement when his friend Rick betrayed him and pleaded guilty. He was disappointed that Rick couldn't hang on. Yeah.
I mean, it puts him in a bad position, right? I mean, this is really his right-hand person pleading guilty to essentially the same exact thing that the government is charging Manafort. So good luck explaining that at trial. I mean, Isha, Charlie, we've all been lucky enough to clerk in federal courts and stuff, and we see government prosecutors do this all the time in the context of drug conspiracies and things like that. And boy, are the odds long when this happens.
Yeah, and we should note, in terms of the Manafort hanging on thing, like, it looks like there's just a lot left in the pipeline, right? So there's the new kind of tax and bank fraud charges. Manafort, understated his income on federal tax returns, various loans he applied for, laundering a bunch of income for the Ukraine stuff. But then, there's a bunch of reporting about new other stuff that Mueller's investigating. So Reuters reported that Mueller's looking into the way that Manafort handled a loan in one of his Los Angeles bankruptcy cases. And he failed to disclose that loan from this lender who's also a sort of major creditor in the California bankruptcy cases, which may have been an illegal concealment of material information as to the bankruptcy case. NBC News is reporting that federal investigators are looking into whether Manafort promised this Chicago banker a White House job in return for $16 million in home loans, which he got from this federal savings bank and banker Stephen Kalk, who is now on the Council of Economic Advisors. So, it doesn't seem like to Charlie's point that they're drumming up more stuff to show him how serious they are. It doesn't seem like there's a shortage of shady business that Manafort has been engaged in.
No, it's really quite something.
It's kind of incredible, yeah, that every day there's some entirely new tentacle of this investigation. And that, of course, is, we talked several weeks ago about Manafort's motion, which is to disqualify Mueller. And, the whole basis of that motion is Mueller was given a specific and narrow charge, and he sort of well exceeded that charge. And we sort of talked about why we think that that's actually not a very particularly strong argument. But, boy, is this investigation far-ranging. And also, boy, does Manafort have a lot of, disparate, shady business to investigate, right? It just seems crazy to me that every day there's some new scandal in a different city involving a different company and a different multi-million-dollar loan.
Yeah, and what's also worth noting is that, if these allegations are proven, he does seem like a pretty bad guy. If it weren't for being Trump's campaign manager, he probably would have skated on all of this. There's an interesting article in Politico about this. Most money launderers just, never get caught. And, something else might have happened that it would have drawn federal investigators' attention. But, I think he kind of thought that being Donald Trump's campaign manager would bring him back from the provinces where he had represented these shadowy foreign clients and was sort of out of the grace of the Republican pantheon. And it really appears to have done the opposite.
Bad move. Oops. So one last thing before we kind of leave this latest round of the Mueller show behind. Jason, you mentioned, Charlie, you also mentioned that Manafort is kind of an old guy. Maybe he's not that worried about time in prison. We should also note the kind of other consequence of what will happen if Mueller's successful is they've sought something called forfeiture against Manafort. And forfeiture, there are two kinds, criminal forfeiture and civil forfeiture. And essentially forfeiture is when you commit a crime, the government can confiscate from you the proceeds of that crime, so any money you earned conducting that crime, and can also confiscate from you any what are called facilitating property or instrumentalities of the crime, so any property you use to commit the crime. And that's actually a fairly broad swath of your stuff. So for example, in the forfeiture allegations against Manafort, they want to seize all his different houses. They want to seize his life insurance policy. They want to seize what are called substitute assets. So anything that basically you can do something called tracing. So if you commit a crime, you put, $30, $30 million in a particular bank account, and then you move that money to different bank accounts and you buy some stuff with it. And one of the things you buy is a yacht. If they can trace the yacht to the money that you earned from this particular crime that you put in this bank account, they can confiscate the yacht. So Manafort really stands to lose just about everything if they can prove this. And what's interesting is that so they can obviously get this stuff if they are able to prove the criminal case. They can also engage in something that's called civil asset forfeiture. And the idea there is even if they can't prove the criminal case, if they can prove civilly, so the standard is just preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt, they can forfeit a fair amount of this stuff, though not the substitute assets I was mentioning, without being able to prove any of these allegations beyond a reasonable doubt, they just have to show by preponderance of the evidence, which is sort of a 51% standard as opposed to like a 99% standard, that the stuff they're trying to grab was either used to commit a crime or he got as a result of committing a crime.
Interesting. So for those who have booked the guest room in any of Paul Manafort's homes this summer, you'll probably be okay this summer, but after that, may want to look for alternate hotel arrangements. Okay, so we'll leave the Mueller show there, as you said, Isha. We do want to get into 3 quick-hitting Trump nuggets because, like we said, we've gotten a lot of feedback and we're watching some other cases closely that we've talked about. So I'll start and then we'll go around the horn. My Trump nugget for the week is just a quick update on a case that we talked about several weeks ago, which was the rescission of DACA by the Trump administration, which was done, according to Jeff Sessions, because the administration had concluded that DACA was illegal. So it ended it, it rescinded it. A federal judge in San Francisco said that that reasoning was arbitrary and capricious and incorrect because DACA was in fact not illegal. A second judge, district judge, also ruled the same way. Before that second order, though, the Trump administration had taken the very unusual step of asking the Supreme Court to directly intervene and hear the appeal directly from a district court, which is to say bypassing the Court of Appeals level of review. The Supreme Court just this Monday did not take the Trump administration up on its offer. I guess the only nugget here, other than the quick update, is to say that I thought that the media's coverage of that denial was slightly misleading. It led the New York Times for a day saying that the justices turned down the appeal from the Trump administration on DACA. True, but it would have been truly extraordinary for the Supreme Court to take it up without any review from the Court of Appeals. And so there was no dissent even from the conservatives or anything. There was just a line in the Supreme Court's order that it expects that the Ninth Circuit and other courts of appeals presumably will hear these cases expeditiously, and it can always take it up then. So to me, this was just the Supreme Court following the usual order and not doing much of substantive note. That said, it does mean that DACA remains because these district court judge decisions must be followed, and they will now work their way up through the system. Okay.
Next Trump nugget. I want to thank RJ Carroll, a listener who wrote us a really interesting email about our discussion of the House of Representatives' release of formerly classified information. And RJ pointed out something that I had no idea was the case. When houses of Congress, the House or the Senate, release classified information, one of the means by which they can do that is something called the Speech and Debate Clause. So the Speech and Debate Clause provides for a blanket immunity for anything that a congressman or senator says on the floor of the House of Representatives. They may not be questioned there in any other place, which means that so long as they just read it into the record, Congress is free to do whatever it wants. So thanks, RJ, and without disparaging all of our other listeners who sent wonderful emails, it is surely among the best listener emails we've ever received.
Indeed. Isha, you want to take us out this week?
Yes. So we got a lot of thoughtful feedback about the position I took on the last episode, which is to say the position that I was somewhat skeptical of a lot of gun control measures because I worry about racial disparities. Federal gun laws are among the most racially disparate impact of all categories of federal laws, because I worry that gun control laws tend to use proxies such as mental health status or former felony convictions or presence in the terrorism watch list that I think are actually really poor proxies for violent behavior, and because I worry about the sort of tendency to say the FBI should have investigated further. And so we had a number of listeners write in. One thing they requested was sort of some sourcing. So in this week's episode, and we'll go back and update last week's show notes, I'll put in links to some of the resources that I was quoting from or citing from. One particular point that a few listeners brought up was the point that using mental health status as a way of implementing gun control, that is sort of saying someone can't get a gun if they're severely mentally ill, may potentially be stigmatizing in the sense that it suggests that we think that those folks are somehow more likely to commit crimes, which we know empirically is not true, but perhaps gets at the reality that one of the sort of undersung tolls that rampant gun possession in the U.S. has is it makes it really, really easy to commit suicide. And so maybe mental health status is a useful proxy because it helps kind of protect a vulnerable group. So that was a point I had not thought about and fully fleshed out. That is something that, so the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, did a study, a decade after the Brady Handgun Violence Act, which established a waiting period and a background check. And it found that law was it made no difference in terms of rates of homicide and suicide, except for among persons 55 and older, where it made a big difference in terms of firearm suicides. So, listener, you're right that there were several of you who wrote in. You're right that there is a whole nother piece to the kind of gun violence puzzle, which is the question of how to prevent suicides that I was not thinking of when I issued my critique last week. And before I leave the subject, I want to give a shout out to listener M. Tong, who is one of our regular listeners and a frequent writer, who suggested that we do this gun control episode way back last November, and we had sort of put it on the back burner, and I'm glad, we were able to share that with listeners. And I also want to commend folks to an article I'll link to that points out that the toll taken by gun violence in different cities is dramatically mitigated or unmitigated by the presence of trauma centers. So they point out that, for example, even though Chicago is lower than, for instance, St. Louis and Baltimore on the list, the sort of gun homicides per capita ranking, it is actually much higher in the sort of gun wounds per capita ranking. It just has such excellent medical facilities and more people are able to survive, which I thought was sort of a fascinating overlay on homicide and gun violence data around the country.
Yeah. So, okay, we'll put those links up and we'll leave it there. So, listeners, we will see you next week. See you, Isha and Charlie.
Bye, guys.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
The red light of the train shines back on me.